Politics and Prose. Oh, there we go. We're working. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. My name is Alan Watke. I'm the director of events here. Um, we're excited for tonight's event, but before we get going, I want to ask you all to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. When we get to the audience Q&A, we have a microphone right up here. For some of you, it's hiding behind a pillar. We are live streaming and recording tonight's event, so we want to capture all of your questions, so please line up at the mic and speak into the microphone as you ask your question. After the event, Edward will be signing right here at this table, so if you could also line up at that pillar, straight back, and we'll come through and ask for your names for personalizations. And then also, as you do that, please fold up the chair you're sitting in and lean in against a shelf or something sturdy. Thank you very much. So without further ado, we're very excited to welcome Edward Wong tonight for the launch of his book, At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning in China. Wong tells a moving chronicle of a family and a nation that spans decades of momentous change and gives profound insight into the new authoritarian age transforming the world. A groundbreaking book, At the Edge of Empire, is the essential work for understanding China today. Edward is a diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, and in 25 years at the Times, he has reported from scores of countries and served as a war correspondent in Iraq and the Beijing bureau chief. He is the winner of the Livingston Award for International Reporting and was on a team of Pulitzer Prize finalists. He has been a Nyman Fellow at Harvard University and a visiting professor at Princeton University and UC Berkeley. He has done fellowships at the Wilson Center and the Belfer Center at Harvard Kennedy School. Wong speaks on global issues to television and radio outlets that include CBS, MSNBC, PBS, NPR, BBC. If you are one, he's on it. He lives with his family here in D.C. Wong will be in conversation tonight with Ishan Tharoor, a columnist on the foreign desk of the Washington Post, where he authors the Today's Worldview newsletter and column. In 2021, he won the Arthur Ross Media Award in commentary, a prize administered by the American Academy for Diplomacy. He previously was a senior editor and correspondent at Time magazine, based first in Hong Kong and later in New York. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Edward Wong and Ishan Tharoor.
Well, thank you all. Thank you. This is a tremendous turnout, and thank you so much to Politics and Prose. First of all, congratulations, Ed. Today is launch day of this tremendous book.
Day one.
And so it's a great honor to be part of the inaugural event, as it were. It's an especially happy privilege for me to be moderating this discussion. Ed and I go back a little bit. I was a cub reporter in Hong Kong around the time Ed was a correspondent and eventual bureau chief in Beijing. And I had the good fortune of being proximate to Ed and a whole kind of class of a kind of golden generation of foreign correspondents based in Beijing. And so it's a real honor to, 18, 19, 17 years later, be here with you right now. The Edge of Empire is, I'll actually read out what I say in the back of the book, which is, I haven't written a book myself, but I guess I'm publishing it now. There we go. Which, it really is, what's so tremendous about it is that it's a completely unique tale of Greater China and the kind of traumas and great hopes and great tragedies of the 20th century. But told in this, and it's a story that, as I say here, that is both intimately personal and fundamentally global. And it is a story of Ed's family, it's a story of China, and it's told by a journalist who, of course, has a very decorated and long career in China, but elsewhere as well, and not least in the Middle East. So I guess to kick off our conversation, Ed, um, how long has this book been in your head? And could you, I guess, talk to us a bit about what drove you to write it, and at what point you felt ready to write it?
Thanks a lot, Sean. That's a question I've thought about for a while now, like from this time I started working on the book. And in a way, it's a book that I've been writing for my entire lifetime. And that's because the roots of it are in childhood when I grew up in Alexandria, right outside of DC. And I saw my parents working hard, sacrificing for our family. And my father, of the two, I saw my father the least. He went to work for long hours in a restaurant, put on a uniform, a red jacket, black pants, and came home very late at night. And then I became more interested in the backstory of what they went through in China when I went to grad school at Berkeley, because I started taking courses in Chinese history and Chinese politics. I had spent a summer studying Chinese in Beijing. So I started to get a handle on China itself. And so on visits home, I would ask them more about their background and their histories in the country. I even made a short student film about it at Berkeley. And then, but I think it was only when I went to Beijing itself in 2008 as a correspondent after some years in Iraq that I really started to probe much deeper into their backstories. And that's because I was then able to travel to many parts of the country that my parents had lived in. I went to Guangdong province in the south where they're from. I went to Hong Kong where my dad was born and where my mom spent her childhood. And I spent time in Beijing where my dad did a brief stint before dropping out to join the military. And then I went out to the far northwest to Xinjiang, where he was posted for a half dozen years as a soldier in the People's Liberation Army.
Right, and the title of the book, At the Edge of Empire, I think the most immediate placing of that is indeed in Xinjiang when your father is deployed there. Before we get to talking about that, could you talk a bit about? I mean, I guess your father is the central character of the book in many ways. How much of his story did you know growing up? How much of his story did you have to piece together in later years?
I mean, I knew very little of the story growing up. And it was only when I was asking him, like I said, in my 20s, when I was home asking him, that he started opening up more about his background as a soldier in the army. He showed me a photograph of himself, which is on the cover of the book here. You'll see this photograph on the cover and on the spine. It's a small photograph that fits in the palm of my hand, black and white. And in it, he's wearing the cap of the PLA at the time and the uniform. It's one of only two existing photographs of him in a uniform. So he started to show me these mementos of his time there, and he very much values having this record of the years that he experienced in China. And again, when I was talking to him, partly I wasn't knowledgeable enough about these very complex areas of China like Xinjiang and the histories there to really ask him the right questions. He would just tell me, I went out to the Northwest, I was in Xinjiang. After I was curious enough where after I finished grad school in 1999, I took a backpacking trip overland from Hong Kong to Delhi, and I spent time going through Xinjiang en route to Pakistan. And I purposely went to some of the places my father had mentioned to me. But even then, I felt my knowledge was superficial, and it wasn't until after I started reporting on those regions and reporting on the tensions that exist now in those areas that I could go back to him and ask him in much greater detail about what he had been doing out there, and then also able to talk to historians and read up on what was happening in those areas of Western China in the 1950s.
So I think for the sake of the audience, let's tell a bit of the story chronologically. Your father comes from a kind of merchant family that was in Hong Kong. He was born in Hong Kong. I guess pick it up from there and tell us, where he goes and why, and the kind of major disruptions of history that propel him along his journey?
Sure. I mean, I think the story is fairly cinematic, and we've seen this in like these sweeping epics on the big screen. We've read some histories of them. And I think in many ways, I think for many people in this room, our parents' generation lived through these, whether they were in Europe or in Asia or Africa or South America. But the great upheavals of the 20th century swept up my father, his family, starting with when he was a child, the Japanese War in China and in Asia when Japan tried to take over much of Asia. And then in 1941, at the same time they attacked Pearl Harbor, they decide to attack British colonies across Asia, and they moved on Hong Kong. And so the opening scene in the book starts with the day that the Japanese invade Hong Kong. And my father still has memories of what he saw that day, the anti-aircraft fire, the airplanes, the Japanese airplanes coming over the harbor. And then he gets sent by his parents with his older brother and other relatives to live in their home village back in China, in Guangdong province. And so he grows up not in Hong Kong, in sort of like this safety of the British colony once the war ends in 1945, but he grows up in China where there's a civil war raging between the communists and the nationalists. And the circumstances under which he was living, even after the Japanese left, made a big impression on him because for many Chinese, the nationalists embodied sort of a misgovernance, corruption. Inflation was rampant. People had to carry these huge bundles of cash, and prices of things would change daily. He saw many homeless people in the streets in cities like Guangzhou. He also saw people gambling. It just felt like that the nationalists didn't have control of the country. And so he was hopeful that Mao and the communists would win the Civil War and then would lead the country into a better place and would sort of rejuvenate China from where it had come since the Japanese occupation. And so then he graduates from high school in 1950, the first class to graduate into communist-ruled China. And his older brother, Sam, who is 4 years older than him, had been living in Guangzhou also, but he chose to come to the U.S. to study engineering. And my father took a very different route, which is he chose to go north to Beijing in order to go to university, but also because he wanted to see the heart of the revolution. Mao had just moved the capital to Beijing, the old imperial capital. My father knew this is where the communist experiment would take place. And so he went there, and then he marched in Tiananmen Square in front of Mao on the first anniversary of the founding of the PRC. He soon dropped out of school, joined the new Air Force, was sent to Manchuria to train for the Air Force, but was very abruptly told after a few months there in an Air Force academy that he would not be sent to Korea to fight the Americans in the Korean War. He had been very intent on doing that to protect his country. And instead, he was told he would have to get on trucks and then go to the far northwest to Xinjiang, which is at that time bordered the Soviet Union. And he was told that he didn't know at first where he was going when he got on these trucks. And then they left the ancient capital of Xi'an which is west of Beijing, and they kept going west. And then he realized at some point as they came to the westernmost reaches of the Great Wall, like where basically in the Chinese conception where civilization ends, he realized that he was being sent into exile and that this was likely the end of his life as he knew it, that he was around 20 at the time. And he thought, I'm going to live out the rest of my life now in the deserts to the west, and I'll never see my family again. And basically my life in China is done. And because for many Chinese, the idea of being sent out beyond the Great Wall, beyond the Great Wall in an area called the J Gate, is to being sent into exile in these, what they consider these barbarian lands out west.
And so he ends up in Xinjiang among Kazakh nomads and Uyghurs and others, at obviously a very different time in Chinese politics than the context that we currently have heard and talked about the situation in Xinjiang. But I guess tell us a bit more about his experience there. How long was he posted there? How did he get out of there? And what were his kind of abiding impressions of being at this veritable edge of empire?
I mean, the Chinese control, the communist control of Xinjiang was a very forceful one from the start because Xinjiang, parts of Xinjiang had wanted to become independent. There was an independent militia there that had actually sided with the Soviets, gotten support from the Soviets to fight the nationalists. But then after the nationalists left, there was a strong independence movement out there. And Mao realized he really had to send the army straight into Xinjiang and basically install military occupation in the region. So there was no soft approach from the beginning. And my father was among the troops that were sent out there. And so the very first mission that he had to do was to go up to the very far north to a place called Altai, which is right, these days it's right on the border of Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and Russia, very remote area. Has a strong Russian influence there, and it was a land of mostly Kazakh nomads. And he was put into a military base there that the Kazakh militia that was out there had been based in, and it was a point at which the communists were trying to break up these militias that had fought the nationalists and incorporate them into the PLA in order to ensure there was no independence movement out there. And so my father and the other ethnic Han soldiers who were sent to Altai, their daily mission was to gather the Kazakh soldiers in a room and to essentially indoctrinate them with communist ideology and talk about how great Mao was, and talk about the revolution and its goals, and to convince them that the Kazakhs were an essential part of that this revolution was a global one. It was one about these broad ideas that would change humanity, and that the overthrowing of sort of an oppressive capitalist system relied on the help of peasants and of nomads. They weren't just it wasn't just a revolution of workers, but it was a revolution of peasants, which is something that Mao had done. Mao really galvanized the farmers across China. It was different than what the Soviets had done.
And this is also a context where you bring in the legacy of the father of current Chinese President Xi Jinping, right? Just talk a bit more about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about these like overlapping or echoes of history that we see is, I spent a lot of my time in China covering Xi Jinping. I still write about his governance today. My father lived under the governance of his father, Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping's father is a well-known communist elder. He was one of Mao's compatriots. He helped Mao out when Mao was fighting his guerrilla war in northern China. And so he was given a high-ranking position after the victory. He was given political control of the entire northwest region of China. So he would help set policy there along with the military generals that were running parts of the Northwest. And at times, Mao and his compatriots, including the elder Xi, would talk about whether they needed to go harder against the Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, and others out there, or whether they needed to pull back. And at the time my father was out there in the early 50s, there was a hardline general named Wang Jun who controlled Xinjiang. Mao told Xi's father to take a softer line out there because he feared that there would be a fierce insurgency if Wang Jun continued his policies. And so he told the elder Xi to get rid of some of the top figures there, pull them back to Beijing, and really institute a more collaborative process with some of the Kazakh and Uyghur leaders out there. My father, after Altai, he was in one of the other postings he did, he told me that for most of a year, they actually sat around and did nothing in the military building that he was in. And he said this was because it was when Xi and Mao had decided to pull back on the hardline policy. So the entire thing was to sit around, not do anything provocative towards the local population. Anyone who served in the military here knows that there's a lot of sitting around in the military, especially in wartime and in combat zones. So.
And I think we'll fast forward a little bit, but was he particularly ideological about all this? Was he imbued by a genuine belief in the Communist Party's mission? Was it more kind of broader nationalism that he felt? And of course, he survives barely the Great Leap Forward. He escapes the Cultural Revolution. At what point did he kind of fall out of love or sort of recognize that China under the communist rule was not a place he wanted to be in?
Well, I don't think he didn't. From my conversations with him, it didn't feel like he was steeped in Marxist ideology or Leninist ideology. I mean, I think it was more a sense of nationalism and rejuvenating China in a way. That is something I think that speaks to many Chinese, and see him like the current Xi has really taken that on as part of his the aura that he's imbued himself with, that he's the one to rejuvenate China. Like he uses that word. And so Mao did the same. And Mao's aim was to bring China up on par with the industrialized nations of the West and to be able to challenge America or challenge Great Britain. And my father really believed this was important because he had seen the ruins that that China had become in both the Japanese War and the Civil War. Now, what changed was once he left Xinjiang, when he was leaving Xinjiang around 1957, that year, he had won the confidence of the politico and the military officers with whom he was working in one of his outposts, and they were going to recommend him for party membership, and that really brought him a sense of confidence to him. He got into a school in Xi'an to study aerospace engineering, build aircraft. He was hoping military aircraft to continue serving the country, but that occurred when the Great Leap Forward was taking place, and the Great Leap Forward was a massive famine that occurred throughout China starting in 1958 because of Mao's economic policies, and over several years, 30 to 40 million people die of starvation and illness. And my father himself fell ill. He could barely walk. He saw his classmates starving. So he knew something was obviously wrong with Mao's leadership and his policies. Around that same time, party officials tell him, oh, your party application, there's something wrong with your application. We have to investigate your background more. And he realized also that on a personal level, the party's ways of doing things were working against him, that even though he had spent all these years out in the far Northwest trying to prove his loyalty to the party, that they still didn't trust him. They looked at his background. They realized his parents, who were merchants or business people, had gone back to Hong Kong, were still running businesses there. His brother had gone to the U.S. to study and was not coming back to China. And so they wondered what was wrong with this person. And I think that it's not just an individual thing. This happened with many people across China. And I think that it's something that is built into the structure of Leninist parties, in the way they try to exert control over the population, in the fears that they create among themselves, and in their idea that there's always subversive elements out there. And it was manifest in the early 50s in some of Mao's campaigns, like the campaign against counter-revolutionaries, where many people were imprisoned, persecuted, and killed. And it continued throughout much of that Mao era history with many campaigns. And I think one of the things to consider is that right now we're seeing a bit of the echoes of that with Xi, where he's talking about trying to root out foreign influences in China, looking for spies, looking for foreign subversives. And a lot of that you saw taking place in the Mao era. My father experienced it. And so that along with the Great Leap Forward, along with Mao's purges of the top military commanders that my father looked up to, people like Peng Dehuai, who was a legendary general. These all made my father realize there is something wrong with the leadership and with the party.
And of course, his journey out of China to the U.S. is not a unique story. This is a story of mid 20th century migration or slightly later that is a story of a lot of the Chinese American diaspora as well. And I'm sure there are some of you in the audience who have similar stories you may want to share. When we turn to questions, could you, I guess, coming back to your dad's experience, how easy was it to write this book fundamentally about his family and about his experience and your family? Was he comfortable in the process of while you were researching and writing it? And while you were piecing the story together, how much were you reckoning? And because there's a lot of really poetic moments in the book, a lot of nostalgia. You stitched together some really wonderful ancient poetry in various parts of it as well. For you, were you finding that you were almost kind of reckoning with the traumas that your parents and your dad in particular experienced over time? And over all these incredible, they lived a lot more history than we have, I guess. And I find it very striking.
Right. Yeah, I think in some ways a book like this is trying to do honor to people in our parents' generations who lived through these epochal events of the 20th century and then tried to build better lives for their families. So it's a book about the diaspora as much as it is about the 20th century in China. The thing that I grappled with, I think, was in what my dad went through was to what degree do we see the seeds of China today planted in the experiences that he went through? Because my career in China was reporting on China today, and so I think one of the things that I was very curious about, for example, was his relationship and the relationship of the soldiers with the non-Han people who were out in Xinjiang, the other ethnicities, and when in my interviews with him, he actually glossed over that maybe in his memory the relations were fairly calm. I don't think he was trying to hide anything from me, but he said, I think relations were pretty good between us and the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs. I didn't sense a lot of tension there. I interacted a lot with the Uyghur and Kazakh soldiers with whom I met. But then when I was researching the book, my uncle Sam, his older brother, he had kept these letters that my father had written him a few years after my father left Xinjiang. And in one of the letters, I found a very interesting passage, which was, after arriving at Xinjiang, my father received a very deep impression of what he saw around him. And he said Xinjiang was a meeting place of 15 or so ethnic groups from in Central Asia. And he said they were very diverse, but they had one thing in common, which was that intense hatred of the Han people. And this is something he never mentioned to me in my interviews. And he might have forgotten those, his first impressions. But he said he unpacked the history in that letter saying, there were warlords that the people didn't trust, ethnic Han warlords, and then warlords who had betrayed them, and then nationalist generals who had taken control and imposed very harsh policies on them. And my father felt when he first saw the hatred, he thought, maybe the communists can turn the tide and win the trust of these people. But of course, we know what direction the communists took their policies in the region. So that was one of those areas of dissonance between what he was telling me and then what I found that he had recorded just a few years after leaving the region.
And, I guess to fast forward to the current moment, the Hong Kong that existed in 1997, forget about when your father was born, seems to have gone. China does have a kind of not new, but China has a kind of revitalized expansionist project that is quite clear, quite imperial in certain ways. The way the leadership in Beijing talks about Taiwan as well. What does your father make of kind of the current geopolitical position of Xi Jinping?
My father looks at Xi. Well, it's interesting. I think I've had conversations with my father on Xi and current politics over the years. I mean, he has remained very interested in Chinese history and Chinese politics. He often reads books on those subject matters in Chinese. And when he visited me and my family in 2012, when my daughter was born in Beijing, we were sitting in front of the TV watching the evening news, the state TV. And then it was right when Xi had taken power in November of 2012. And he said, I remember this line. He said, "The Communist Party today is so corrupt. It's more corrupt than the nationalists were when I was living in China. And I hope Xi can clean it up. I hope he can bring good leadership to the party and clean it up." And then fast forward to last year when I was in the late stages of writing my book, and we were having a conversation after lunch at my Uncle Sam's house. And I asked both him and Sam what they thought of China at that moment. And my father didn't really want to answer at first. He said, "We've talked so much about this." But then he came back to me an hour later and he said, you know, Mao was had some good intentions at first. He had some positive plans in his program, but he held on to power too long, and power changes people. And then he said Xi should have given up his power. For those who aren't familiar with it, Xi is now in his third term, going into his next. He's already done 10 years of rule from 2012 to 2022. Then he changed the norms in China in order to hold on to power for at least 5 more years, maybe more beyond, maybe for life. And that has scared many liberal Chinese, as well as many people here in the government in the U.S., because they see an autocrat like Putin taking shape now in Xi. And my father has the same thought. He knows that the disasters that befell China got worse and worse as Mao got older. And I think he is very worried about what direction China is going with Xi. And I think things like the harder line that Xi has taken in places in Western China, on Hong Kong, the more bellicose language he uses around Taiwan or the South China Sea, the military push that's taking place in the Indian Himalaya. All these things, I think, are part of Xi's more greater tolerance for risk, greater than recent Chinese leaders, and also they could become bolder as he ages.
I think this is a good point to bring you into the conversation a bit more. You yourself, just as a New York Times reporter, have covered a huge arc of Chinese history. The time that we overlapped when I was based in China or in Hong Kong and you were in Beijing was still a period of relative optimism, excitement. When I would visit, your friends in Beijing and see you, it seemed like this incredibly fun, bubbly place full of young American expats drivers. The moniker that Beijing is the new Brooklyn was a real thing that people would say.
Everything was the new Brooklyn. If you read the New York Times, everything's the new Brooklyn.
Well, Beijing was one of the Brooklyns. So I guess, how do you think about the difference of China when Ed Wong was a Beijing bureau chief, and China when Ed Wong went with Secretary Blinken last year as a diplomatic correspondent to Beijing?
Yeah, you saw some of those days in China. Sean, I remember that's where we first met, when you would visit Beijing from Hong Kong. And I think that for all of us, and I know there were some people here in the audience who were in China during those late, like in the 2000s to early 2010s, that it was kind of a heady period for many of us. Like we felt that the country could move in many different directions. I think looking back on it, it's clear now that there were not that many paths in front of China, that the party already taken steps in a more authoritarian direction even before Xi took power, but that it was still open to a lot of the more liberal economic policies that we saw shape China of the 1990s and the early 2000s. It was also more open to engagement with ideas from the outside, and with having a lot of people from other countries come in and take over roles of great responsibility, whether it was at universities, in businesses, and advising some Chinese officials even. So now it's become a lot more closed. When I flew in with Blinken last year, it was at probably the lowest point in U.S.-China relations in decades. And State Department officials told me later that they were afraid that the entire relationship could go off the rails at any moment. This was a year ago, because the spy balloon episode had just taken place in the U.S., which I'm sure many of you recall. And the Biden administration and Blinken himself had accused the Chinese in public of being on the verge of giving weapons to Russia to aid their war in Ukraine. And so tensions were intense. And China had been very closed off for years at that point. Like it had completely shut itself off from the outside world in the pandemic. And then it seems that Xi and his aides had used that as an excuse to keep many things closed off. Like they weren't giving out many types of visas initially to students or business people to come back. They were letting the Ministry of State Security have much more influence within China and to investigate foreigners and businesses, to really go after certain types of companies, for example. And so it really felt like that there were these faint echoes of the Mao era taking place in a closed-off China, and that was what was happening when we flew in. And what was interesting, I think, Sean, if you remember the years when you were there and when I was there, that we saw a lot of foreigners making their way through Beijing. It could be anyone from a student who was there for a few months to, a multinational executive. But I saw very few foreigners when I was there a year ago, and I think that's still the case right now.
I'd love to get questions from the audience. Please start lining up by the microphone here. Sure, please introduce yourself as well.
My name is Robin Broadfield, and I was formerly the environmental program manager for the World Bank for East Asia. So I worked in China for 10 years on environmental issues. The thing that I'm most curious about with respect to China is, given your pretty grim picture of the growth of authoritarianism and continued corruption in China, China's anti-poverty and economic performance has been extraordinary over the last 20 years. How was China able to achieve such poverty alleviation and economic growth success in an environment of growing authoritarianism and corruption?
Well, the growing authoritarianism, I would say it only accelerated to a very notable degree, say from the late 2000s onward. The explosion of wealth, of middle class living standards that you're talking about, and even from extreme poverty up to more than subsistence level, lower class, that took place because China had been at a very low level after the Cultural Revolution of Mao coming out in 1976. And then when Deng Xiaoping decided to even open up some parts of the economy later in the reform era, then it was sort of an easy lift for China. Like they were opening up this like vast energy that had been suppressed. There were experiments with private entrepreneurship, starting with farmers in certain parts of China. And then, for example, Xi Jinping's father, Xi Jinping, was sent to the south and then he governed an area called Shenzhen, a city called Shenzhen, right across from Hong Kong. That became one of the first urban experimental zones. It was rural back then, but it became an urban experimental zone where they would experiment with market forces there. So it was there was a lot of low-hanging fruit, I guess, from coming out of the Mao era to boost China's productivity. And I have to say that, yes, the Communist Party is consistently authoritarian, but it is also has proven itself very adaptable in many ways, so that it could take it would look at policies, it would try out some ones that it felt were a threat, it would get rid of those, and then ones that succeeded without threatening the party, it would embrace those. And I think that until now, we've seen them being able to do that adaptation fairly adeptly. The question is, can they continue doing that? And right now, there's a lot of skepticism about that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Hi, Ed. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Really excited to read your book. My name is Helen. I'm a former Australian diplomat, served in Hong Kong and in Beijing, and I'm the co-founder of Intrigue Media. My question is about the Asian diaspora, specifically Chinese diaspora in Western countries. there's been a lot of literature written about this in terms of how Asian diaspora, Chinese diaspora, being sort of weaponized by the CCP through the United Front to perpetuate the agendas overseas. What are your thoughts on this, and what would you recommend Western countries do? Because I think in some ways Chinese diaspora is stuck in a rock and a hard place because they're also, I think, marginalized in some areas of Western society, like in Australia and other Five Eyes countries. So keen to hear your thoughts on that, both in the US and also internationally.
Yeah, it's an interesting year from Australia because I think a lot of the debate and discourse around sort of more shadowy forces of the CCP operating abroad are taking place in Australia right now.
We're the testing ground, quite literally.
Yeah, that's the way it's framed as Australia is a testing ground for this. I do think that organizations like the United Front, which is an arm of the Communist Party that seeks to form ties with other groups around the world in order to not necessarily like pull them into the party's orbit, but in order to set conditions overseas where the party can then try and spread its ideas quietly. I do think that there are parts of the CCP like that, and they do seek to operate overseas. I am not convinced that that's made any big difference in our societies right now, and that this idea of subversives operating in America or Australia is not that different than the way many other countries operate in their own manners in trying to exert influence in the U.S. And we see this, and as a reporter here covering diplomacy, I try and document this. We see this happening with many other countries, whether it's like France or the Gulf countries, for example, that have a lot of money, or places like Singapore. Like they're constantly trying to exert influence on U.S. policy in different ways. Sometimes it's in very broad ways with lots of wealth being passed around. And I think in D.C., many people who work in political circles in Washington understand that. Other times it's by trying to put pieces of a country's propaganda into the American media ecosystem. And I'm not convinced that a lot of that has succeeded, especially when they try and do like that grassroots organizing or grassroots dissemination propaganda. We see it from Russia a lot, for example. And sometimes the rhetoric gets into U.S. discourse, but oftentimes it also doesn't. So, and I think especially with Chinese propaganda, it hasn't been that successful. Like the party's propaganda has not really seized the imagination of many Americans yet. I do think that they in Russia are trying to push disinformation into the system and sort of erode the idea that there's fundamental truths that we can grasp onto. I think that that's also very dangerous, but I think that that's the thing that they're more aiming at right now.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, Will Malden, formerly with the Wall Street Journal. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and Will was with me on the trip with Blinken to China a year ago.
Yeah, and can I just say one comment very quickly, which is that in the book, it sounds like Ed, all these photographers and local people and assistants are helping him all the time, but in reality, he's helping people everywhere he goes. On that trip, when he was documenting the hot weather, he was helping me buy tea. He was translating to get the dietary restrictions for a dozen reporters, including people who couldn't eat nuts, pork, and gluten. And it was absolutely amazing to have Ed on that trip.
It's always good to eat with Ed.
Yes, yes.
I'm glad I was a good fixer for the Wall Street Journal on that trip.
Yeah, so he's the most helpful reporter around it from the Middle East to China. But I just wanted to ask if you had any sense or any intuition about how your fine book is going to be read in Washington policy circles. I mean, obviously, it illuminates so many parts of China and the immigrants and the government over decades. But I'm wondering, if you have any early indications for how the seventh floor of the State Department, or how a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, or perhaps one of his or her staffers who reads more books would or a member what they would take away from it, and you provide a few hints of your own point of view through kind of some concerns about empires from the British in Hong Kong to the Manchus but I'm just wondering if you have any early takes on that or intuition.
Yeah, that's a good question. And when I wrote the book, I didn't write it with policymakers in mind. Like the entire purpose of my book is to have the average reader who probably doesn't know much about China come to it and learn a lot about China and a lot about the diaspora and a lot about what motivated Chinese citizens throughout the decades. The only part, there's two parts of the book where I explicitly address geopolitics. One is in a chapter on that's a profile of Xi, and there I talk about the first meetings between Biden and Xi, which I witnessed in 2011 to 2012, and the atmosphere of U.S.-China back then. The other one is when we went. There's the last chapter is about our trip back to Beijing with Blinken. I think that if you were coming to it, a lot of policymakers already have some knowledge of China. And I think one of the things I want people to take away from the book is that there's a lot of contingency in history and in decision making, in that a lot depends on individual leaders. And so both the US and China, a lot of people in Washington, when you talk to them about China, one of the first things they ask within minutes of opening conversations, will the US and China be in a war soon? Will they clash over Taiwan or something else? But will these two nuclear armed superpowers be fighting each other? And my answer is I guess I feel that there's less possibility or probability of war than some other members of the foreign policy establishment in Washington might think. One, I think that there's certain structural things that hold them back, such as the fact that each have nuclear powers, for example. Look at how carefully both Russia and the US are avoiding confronting each other directly over Ukraine, because each has nuclear weapons. Also, the economies of the countries are intensely intertwined, and China's economy is intertwined closely with other countries around the world, and that's not going down. In fact, as US-China tensions have increased, trade has increased between the volume of trade between the two countries is higher now than it was years ago, even before the pandemic. And so I feel like there's structural things, but at the same time, beyond that, there's also the individual decision making by leaders. So a lot of it will depend on what choices both Biden and Xi make now, whoever our next U.S. president is will make in the next 5 years, and then what Xi will decide to do. Throughout the course of this talk, a lot of it I've sounded very pessimistic about the direction Xi is taking the country, but you never know what piece of information he might get where he could decide to throw a different switch within this policymaking system. So those are some of the things I hope people take away from the book.
Thank you.
Thanks for a great talk. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I have no connection with China, except that I grew up in New England, where there was a big China trade in the 18th and 19th century from places like Salem and Nantucket. And so New England was flooded with Chinese merchandise, paintings, all kinds of things. And it's a marvelous high civilization, it got going long before the West. My question is, Hong Kong. Your father is from Hong Kong. What does he think of what happened and what's going on now? It's pretty awful.
Yeah, I think in my not only my father's family, but my mother's family is also from Hong Kong. I think they consistently think that what has happened in Hong Kong is dramatically changing the city, and for the worse, and that there might not be going back. Like the Hong Kong that they have thought about throughout their lives is sort of fading off into history now. I just want to point out that my mother is here sitting in the front row. She's also from Hong Kong, grew up there. And she has had, I think she's been even more concerned about Hong Kong than my father has. Like she and her siblings grew up there in childhood. A lot of their closest friends and family were there, and some have remained there. And also my mother experienced a different side of China pretty early on in the revolution, different than my father did. Like she and her family were persecuted immediately when the communists took over. They were persecuted in southern China because they were landowners. She tells me a story about how her mother was made to kneel at night in front of sort of communist acolytes in the village who were persecuting the family, and then shouted at. And so the family very early on decided they had to flee China, and they went to Hong Kong. So Hong Kong, in their mind, was this place of refuge for them, even more than for my father, because my father was born in Hong Kong, and he eventually went back to it. But for my mother's family, Hong Kong was a sanctuary from the depredations of communism. And so I think now, with what we've seen, it no longer exists as that. One interesting thing I think is my own memories of Hong Kong. I first went there in '97, right in the weeks right before the handover.
Right.
And there's a whole chapter on that, chapter 2 in the book, where I talk about my feelings, what I saw, and a lot about the experiences of my cousin Eugene there. And at that moment, everything, people felt it could go either way. People thought, oh, maybe, I remember people saying and reading this, maybe Hong Kong could change China somehow. Maybe the influence of rule of law, of open systems, of more liberal economics would exert an influence on Beijing. But sadly, that hasn't happened.
Thank you.
All right, as you just heard, just 2 more questions. If we can get them in quickly, maybe we can try to squeeze in a couple more.
Yeah, mine is actually more of a logistical question. My father has written a book, and he's got a lot of factual information in there. But I know there's lots of gaps that you probably had to fill in, and some of them may have been from your readings, doing research, speaking to relatives. I know that when I talk to my relatives about what my father wrote, my aunt says, "Oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about." He's making that stuff up. My father he told me about that her book was junk. And I talked to one of my relatives about 30 years ago in Beijing, who's a tour guide, and I was much younger, so I was asking her very naive questions like, do you really think that Mao's a good person? And she was like, stop asking me. She was getting very irritated at me. Stop asking me these questions because I don't want to answer them, and I don't want to getting out that I gave you some kind of crazy answer. And I said to her, look, I'm in the United States. I'm not going to be telling anybody. She's just told me just to stop asking. So did you kind of have those kind of issues with when you maybe did some interviews with relatives or even just people in China to try to fill in those gaps? And how did you fill in those gaps? How many research hours? It must have been an intense amount of work.
Yeah, the main gaps I fill in weren't things about contemporary China. I had already spent so many years in China, and I felt like I knew a lot of the lay of the land when I was writing out those chapters. The gaps, as you initially pointed out, were in the things that happened in the 20th century, with the things my father's talking about, especially in Xinjiang, because there's not a lot of written history from that period on what happened there. And so he would tell me things like, oh, we were sent to Altai, and I was told to link up with these Kazakhs who were in the Fifth Army. And it was like he kept using this term, the Fifth Army. I didn't really understand what that designated or what it meant. And then I was reading a book with academic papers on Xinjiang. And one of them said, oh, the Fifth Army was the name given that the communists gave to what was the Ili National Army, which was the army of sort of a nationalist of Kazakh Uyghur soldiers and others with a very nationalist drive that fought against the nationalists. And when the communists tried to integrate them into PLA, they assigned them certain names, and the Fifth Army was the name they assigned to this one unit. So, and then elsewhere, I read about the Ili National Army and what their aims were. So it was only by reading up on academic scholarship that I was able to piece together certain terms that my father was using. And I think that I really think you have to spend a lot of time talking with professors or reading scholarship. I love talking with academics, and I find it very easy to reach out to them there, and I find them very receptive to questions. So there are some academics in this area, like Jim Millward, a professor at Georgetown, who teaches about the Qing dynasty and about the history of Xinjiang, who were invaluable for helping me piece together the context of what my father was telling me.
You also went to Altai and tried to research there directly. Let's put a pin in that, right? I just want to quickly get the last couple of questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you for this talk. Another logistics question. My question revolves around how has China's foreign policy, specifically the Belt and Road Initiative, been affected by what's been happening in Western China with the, let's call it, sinicization of Western China?
And sorry, if we can just get one more question behind you, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Emily. I'm one of NPR's China correspondents. I'm curious, Ed, how was it talking to your father? Was it hard to get him to open up about this history? And why did he want to tell his story now?
Great questions. First, I'll address the question about have the repressive measures taken by Beijing against the Uyghurs and others in Xinjiang. I assume that's what you're talking about, the sinicization.
As related to the broader Central Asia Belt and Road Initiative.
Right. I haven't, I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is a very broad term, and it's not as monolithic, I think, as a lot of, policymakers or others make it out to be. Like, it's basically a lot of different things falling under one umbrella of different companies trying to do different things in different parts of the world. But in general, the measures that China has taken have not had a huge impact on foreign policy. Muslim countries around the world have not castigated China for what it's done. There was some tension with Turkey, but now Turkey and China are trying to smooth over that relationship. There was tension with Turkey because the Uyghurs are Turkic-speaking Muslims, so there's an affinity between the Turks and the Uyghurs. And a lot of Uyghurs have fled to Turkey. But Erdogan has tried to patch up the relationship, the earlier tense relationship with Xi. So I don't think that the measures have had a huge impact on China's foreign policy. Emily's question about my father, was he open? He was open talking about it even a couple decades ago when I was in grad school and started to do more research and making this like student film about some of his experiences. And I think partly it's because it's so long ago, that history, it's like far back in the past. And I found that as I get older, like I'm in my early 50s now, a lot of what it puts a lot of things in perspective and a lot of things in your, that you did in your 20s or 30s, even if they were foolish or things that weighed on you a lot back then, you no longer look back at those things with that sense of gravity. And I think that he felt it was valuable to have his experiences recorded. I think he knows that he's among the very few Chinese who were sent out to these far Western regions in the early days of Mao, and that what he saw out there and the project on which he had embarked was something that defined China in many senses, and that it was important for people to know about. And also I think that he also has a certain level of nostalgia about that early era of communism. And so he talks about how back then young people especially were willing to be part of this greater project and to sacrifice, their for a greater good. And I think that sense of national idealism is something that he thinks back fondly on, despite all the things he experienced later on in the 1950s.
All right, thank you all so much. Thank you, Ed. Congratulations.